good evening, and welcome back to Drawing Journalism. I'm your host, Laura, and today's episode will be about journalism during World War II, as well as how video helped diplomacy. Remember, if you have any questions at any point, I have a Google form in the description below, and I even learned how to link it. I will be answering any questions on the last episode of Drawing Journalism. In the previous episode, we learned that radio certainly did not help with the Titanic, and opinions stirred in newspapers. While the opinions in the newspaper didn't cause the war, it did help round up public support for the war and helped Woodrow Wilson out. Well, how did this develop, and what were journalists' response during World War II? That is the question I plan to answer in this episode. So sit back and enjoy history getting worse. I think you all know what's coming next. Like usual, I will give a background of this period so events make more sense, cause even I forget history sometimes. After Woodrow Wilson came Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge, who ended out the 1920s and led us into the 1930s. Now, Warren Harding was not an amazing president, and after his death, a series of scandals he was involved in came out, and he was thought of one of the worst presidents in history. Not a good look starting out in the 1920s. Then, Calvin Coolidge came and quietly ended all the scandals that Harding caused. So, he was a pretty good president. I will not be talking about them, however, because I will mainly be talking about the Great Depression, meaning we will meet Herbert Hoover. Before Hoover and the Great Depression happened, the radio was mainly used for operas, news, weather, stock market, and bedtime stories for children. You know, my favorite thing about Hoover was the fact that Hoover bills were named after him. Imagine being president and a town made out of terrible material that they found, like scraps, was named after you. That's really how you know your citizens do not like you. So, yeah, everyone was suffering, and none of his efforts really worked. So when it came to 1932 presidential campaign and election, everyone voted for Franklin Roosevelt. So, what did Roosevelt do to help the Great Depression? Well, among all the tax cuts and new job employments, he also calmed the public with his fireside chats. So, we learned from last episode that there was a new form of media called the radio, and we learned that it caused panic around the Titanic. However, there was hope for diplomacy to come along with the radio, and it did. The radio played an important part of diplomacy because politicians knew the power of the radio and could address the public without having their speeches filtered by the press. This brings me to the fireside chats Franklin D. Roosevelt used in his presidency. These chats focused on the problem and successes during the Great Depression. U.S. citizens loved the fireside chats and had more approval for Franklin D. Roosevelt. These radio talks were praised because they could not misrepresent or misquote. The radio broke the boundary of misinterpreting words and speeches. It was a new hot item. Radios did have some flaws, however, like radio propaganda, but didn't change citizens' mind on the radio, however. They thought that the radio had better news to give them than the paper press did. So, once radio was made, the US put more regulations and rules on what could be said. The government could still manipulate the public, but the radio brought news at least. News, peace, and comfort in the terrible times of the Great Depression. Radio brought on a new age of influence in the US and became a prominent part of many US citizens' lives. It is seen that the radio is the first development towards present-day news reporting. Larry, did you hear that Martha overheard Jimmy talking about overhearing a Congress member who found that the committee heard that the president's niece's kid is dating a socialist? That's crazy, Jerry. I knew I never trusted that president. You can probably guess what I'm about to talk about next, which is gossip, specifically the impact of gossip. First, you listeners need to know a new generation of journalists came during the late 1930s. These journalists had names readers recognized because they were pushing the boundaries of journalism by including gossip and first-hand reporting of Hitler. One popular name was Walter Winchell. Man, I wish I had a name that was illiterate. Walter Winchell incorporated gossip into newspapers. He stood out so much that even Hearst offered him a job. This is when gossip started taking its place in newspapers. When times got hard with the Depression, Winchell switched to radio. Already being a household name, Winchell on the radio became incredibly popular. Winchell talked about so many different topics, such as the chances of third term for FDR to America's relations with Stalin. I do have to say, I am strongly with radio. As you can tell with my podcast, love the radio. Anyway, Winchell had strong opinions, and he did not hesitate to speak them. Since Winchell was more popular than Hearst, listeners of the radio sided with his ideas. Thank you for sitting with me. Now knowing all the background information, I will start on World War II. The war started in 1941, and the US decided not to join. Press was pushing for more isolationism as well, but on December 7, 1941, warplanes from Japan attacked the US fleet. This caused an immediate halt in the press fighting about isolationism because the US finally decided to take action. After the initial attack, it was difficult to get information to the public because the government pushed for censorship. It was not difficult to keep the news of the attack away from the papers and radios because the US was already practicing censorship. From here on out, censorship would only worsen because information was now considered a weapon because of the war. News from overseas was now in demand by the US public. Many wanted to know the details of the war, because Americans don't do well when information is withheld. Luckily, reporters were working overseas to get news back to the US about the war. It is reported that there were more than 1,600 war correspondents and as many as 500 full-time American reporters. Not only was the public getting news, but they also got propaganda. I mean, did you expect anything new? We talked about this last time too. Just like Woodrow Wilson, Roosevelt knew the power media had on the US public. Knowing that he'd have to get people on board with supporting the war, he had his administration, and I quote, assemble an army of communicators. The OWI, also known as the Office of War Information, spewed propaganda, and these types of agencies drew attention to atrocious stories happening in other countries. These efforts were mainly focused on the US population, but military propaganda also caused German soldiers to surrender by being promised safety, food, and shelter. However, propaganda efforts were discouraged by many journalists. While many people think journalists encouraged propaganda by putting it in their newspapers, this is not the case. Government organizations forced newspapers to have propaganda to help out the US. However, propaganda wasn't the only battle journalists went through this time. Do you want to know the worst thing about censorship? Censorship is just and that's why anyone can get past censorship. But let me go on with the information. Censorship was most prominent during World War II. This is because newspapers almost always had the front pictures that readers trusted, and they were including stories from regions that were participating and battling in the war. So they were scared, and they didn't want to open a paper and see that a family member was dead. This fear is what drove the government to encourage censorship. Any photo or piece of news that might be gruesome was also censored. However, readers and listeners were getting falsely optimistic news. OWI reports, also known as the Office of War Information, polls revealed that Americans were feeling complacent, even cocky, about the progress of the war. Nearly 60% of them predicting German defeat within a year. While the government avoided upsetting the people, other officials feared that they were censoring too much. Another reason for censorship was to bring hope to American citizens. American citizens on the front lines were helping out by volunteering and donating money. The government was afraid that uncensored photos and news would lead to citizens' morale being broken, which in turn would lead to defeat. Propaganda and censorship were considered issues to journalists because they had to be wary of what they put in their newspapers. However, the government found censorship and propaganda to be useful because they knew it would get the US citizens on their side. Many US citizens had hope because of the censored media, which was not showing the full picture. This helped boost morale and support for World War II. After war's end, censorship became less strict, and since there was so much hate against censorship amongst the press, journalists, and news. The end of World War II brought on a new type of journalists, Cold War correspondents. But that's all for today. You'll just have to stay tuned. Thank you for joining me on Drawing Journalism. The next episode will be all about another war. Grab your jackets, it will be a cold one. Don't forget to subscribe and have your questions answered by submitting questions down below in the description. Lastly, visit my Instagram page to get reminders and extra content on media and misinformation. My Instagram handle is @drawingjournalism, and this will also be in the description. This is your host, Laura, signing off.